Hello again and welcome to the Tobago House of Assemblies Division of Education, Innovation and Energy e-learning program. My name is Kimarie Richardson Thomas and we are going to go through our CAPE communication studies with a specific emphasis today on our multiple choice paper. So let's take a look at what it is we're going to do as we explore this today. We have one main objective today. And that objective is that at the end of this session, students will be able to respond to a variety of multiple choice questions based on communication studies content. As you know, your exam this year will focus primarily on that paper 1 in collaboration with your internal assessment. When you're looking at your paper 1, the layout of that paper 1 will cover the 3 modules that you have studied in preparation for your exam. So you have your 3 modules and we're going to discuss them or divide our questions looking at those 3 modules. Those 3 modules will comprise of 45 questions. The paper is going to be divided into these sections. The first 7 questions, which would be our section A, Section A, questions 1 to 7, will be your listening comprehension. You will be given a passage, or it will not be given to you. Your teacher will read that passage for you while you look at the questions, and after it's been read to you twice, you will respond to those questions. So after you've done Section A, everything else that remains will be your Section B. And in our Section B, we're going to get the rest of our modules divided accordingly. Questions 8 to 15, thereabout, is usually going to be your Module 1 content. Questions 16 to 30 would usually be your Module 2 content. And then you're going to find that primarily around questions 31 to 45, you will have your Module 3 content. So let's take a look at the first part of your paper. Your Module 1, Gathering and Processing Information, Section A, items 1 to 7. This is our listening comprehension. I'm going to read to you a passage twice. Before I read the passage the first time, you're going to be allowed to look at the questions. And this is an idea of the instructions that you will be getting on your exam day. The invigilator will instruct you accordingly and your teacher will be there to read your passage for you. But before you hear the passage, you will be allowed some time to look at these 7 questions. Here we're going to look at a sample of 7 questions that represent the types of questions you can be asked in Section A of your paper 1. So you're going to take a few minutes, and what I'm asking you to do is to take some pictures. You can take a picture. We have 4 slides looking at these questions, and I want you to pay close attention to them before I begin to read. Question 1. What is the setting in the first stanza? So immediately what you should be directed to understand, if you're seeing first stanza, it tells you something about the kind of extract. If you're seeing first stanza, that should tell you that your extract is going to be a poem. So you begin to prepare to listen out for a poem. The next question asks, which of the following best expresses the meaning of the phrase, blowing his nose to clear the sadness of departure? 2 things you have to pay attention to when you have a question like this. First of all, it says which of the following best expresses the meaning of the phrase. It means that there may be other answers or other options that also express the meaning, but which of the 4 is the best one of the options presented? The second thing you have to pay attention to before you hear the passage based on this type of question is they've given you a quotation to listen out for. You have to make sure that you're paying attention to when this line appears in the reading. It's very key. Then we have question 3. Which of the following best explains the purpose of stanza 2? 2 key elements. Again, which of the following best explains, but now you're given additional information about your poem. Question 1 asked about stanza 1, and now you're hearing something about stanza 2. What this is telling you is that, okay, the structure of this poem is not limited to one stanza. So you need to listen out for where there are spaces and breaks in the reading that would indicate they've moved on to another stanza. Question 4 asks, the tone of the poem can be described as. If you're given a question that speaks about tone, what should you be focusing on while it's being read? Vocabulary. Pay attention to the vocabulary. You pay attention to the vocabulary that you're hearing during the reading, because the vocabulary will give you a very clear distinction as to the tone of the poem. Question 5. Which of the following expressions from the poem does not refer to the central theme of the poem? Now, these are what I like to call sometimes the tricky ones. It's very easy for you to identify what is there, but now you have to move aside the information that you've been given and identify what's not there. So it's like removing the clutter. So while you're listening to the poem, try to identify which of these you're actually hearing in the reading, so that through process of elimination, you're able to identify which of them you're not hearing in the poem. So as you go through and you're making your notes, listen out. Listen out which of the following expression does not refer to the central theme. And because it's going to be read to you twice, when you hear it the first time, draw your conclusion so that when it's read to you the second time, you can make a sound judgment. Number 6 says the main idea of the poem is that. When we were preparing for Module 1, especially when we thought you would have been getting the Paper 2, Paper 2 had for their Module 1 essay a question that looked at you writing out the main idea. A lot of time would have been spent on teaching you how to identify the main idea. And I'd like to refer you to one of our first lessons in communication studies, where we looked at, I think it's the second lesson, we looked at how to identify the writer's main idea and the writer's purpose. So I'd want you to refer to that and check back in your notes. The main idea is a type of summary of what this entire passage is about. So when you've heard the reading the first time, listen out the second time to confirm what is the main idea. And then question 7 says, which of the following literary devices are not used in the poem? This is a 2-part structure kind of question. They've given you what it is you're looking for, and then the answers that would show the combination of what it is you want to find. What do I mean by that? When you're listening to the passage, see if you can identify any of these elements. And once you can identify any of those elements, it's through the process of elimination you're going to get your answer. So let's listen. I'm going to read the passage for you the first time, but while it's being read, and I did ask you to take your pictures, look at them as you're going through, but while it's being read, we're going to have our questions in front of us. So pay close attention to the first reading and you can make your notes. Let us begin. Depart Your Lounge by Mervyn Morris. The young man, when the flight is called, is blowing his nose to clear the sadness of departure. The girl who's leaving looks composed. They're traveling on different planes to different destinations. Each time we die a little when we are young, these moments devastate. But partings down the years have helped to make me ready to say goodbye. Now you're going to be given just a few minutes, about a minute actually, to review your questions. And then we're going to read it for a second time. So let's listen to the second reading and pay close attention to those elements in your question. Departure Lounge by Mervyn Morris. The young man, when the flight is called, is blowing his nose to clear the sadness of departure. The girl who's leaving looks composed. They're traveling on different planes to different destinations. Each time we die a little when we are young, these moments devastate. But partings down the years have helped to make me ready to say goodbye. So that would have been the second reading, and it is at this point you would be told to begin. And you would begin to answer your questions, and you would continue from your first section, section A, with questions 1 to 7, and continue on to items 8 to 45. So let's go through now what some of these questions can look like and how do you go about answering them so that you can maximize your exam success. So the first question asks, what is the setting in the first stanza? Now again, you were not able to see the passage, but you were listening. I'm asking that as you would have listened and you made your notes, that you should have been able to do some elimination. The setting of the first stanza, there were some keywords that should have been able to help you identify that the setting for this first stanza is an airport. So that if your answer for number 1 is B, you are correct. We heard talk about departure, we heard talk about flights, and these were keywords to help you remember. It's not a train station, it's not an underground station, it's not a funeral, but an airport. Item number 2 says, which of the following best expresses the meaning of the phrase, blowing his nose to clear the sadness of departure? Now we understand that the blowing of the nose can be one of two things. You have the cold or you're crying. So when we look at our options, A says the young man is crying, B says the young man is devastated by the departure, C, the young man copes with his grief by weeping, D, the impending departure has made the young man ill. Now, we have identified that when we look at this question, because we are talking here about which one best expresses the meaning of the phrase, we realize that there can be other answers, other possible answers. But which of those answers is the best one? So is it that the young man is crying? Yes, he's crying, but why? The young man is devastated by the departure. We gather that when we were listening to the passage, that someone was leaving and someone was sad. The young man copes with his grief by weeping, and the impending departure might make him ill. While all of these are possible options, our best option, the option that expresses the meaning the best, is actually that the young man is devastated by the departure. Yes, he's crying. Yes, he's coping with his grief by weeping. But when we talk about it, why is he crying? Why is he weeping? And we need to have that clearly articulated in our response. D says that the impending departure has made the young man ill. There was nothing really to indicate to us that this young man had become ill or that he was sick. He was devastated, he was saddened by the departure. Someone was leaving, and this was affecting him greatly. Item 3. Which of the following best explains the purpose of stanza 2? Now, you were not able to see the passage, But in reading, from listening carefully, it is hoped that you would have understood when we got to stanza 2. And what was taking place in stanza 2? Stanza 2 indicated a sort of shift from what was taking place at the departure lounge and made reference to when we are young. And what it is it's wanted to do is not just to show that everyone has to die, but it wanted to include the young people in the grief of parting. It wanted to include the young, that you'd be able to understand that parting and grief is not just something among the elderly or among older people, but it's to include the young people in grief of parting. Question 4 says, the tone of the poem can be described as, and we need to understand what these words mean. But if you're able to clearly understand that there was a sadness in the tone with the crying and the weeping, and there was grief, and you're getting vocabulary that lends itself to sadness, then if you've identified A, sober, it's a very sober, somber, sad type of tone. Now understand, even though the young man was weeping, he was not hysterical in his grief. He was not bawling down the place. But there was a solemnity and a sadness with the departure. So it's what tells us that it had a sober tone. Let's look at item 5. Item 5 says, which of the following expressions from the poem does not refer to the central theme of the poem? In order to answer this, you need to know what is the central theme. So without even looking at the options, be able to identify what is the central theme, the central meaning of the poem. And the central theme of this poem had to do with departure. It had to do with expressions of departure. So let's look at the options. A says, ready to say goodbye. Is that captured in the theme? Yes, it is. Because goodbye is a form of departure. B says, each time we die a little. Is that captured within our theme? Yes, by the word die. Dying is a type of permanent departure. So this is captured. These moments devastate. Well, we've been able to identify that the departure was devastating, but we don't have anything in this option that speaks of departure. So let's hold here. And then D says, blowing his nose to clear the sadness of departure. So we have here, again, our central theme being mentioned in D. This tells us that if you've selected item C, you are correct. Item C is our answer because it's not an expression that refers to our central theme. Then we have 6. The main idea of the poem is A, the author learns to accept partings. B, people find it painful to deal with partings. C, people eventually learn to deal with partings. And D, 2 young people are parting company on different flights. The main idea, and again it's through listening, we can be tempted to think that it's just about learning to accept and that the author learns to accept partings. But throughout the actual poem, what we are able to understand is that the writer moves away from himself and includes others. And he actually shows how the act of parting and being able to accept it is a universal theme. So that he speaks clearly about people eventually learning to deal with partings. Let's look at item 7. It's the final item in our listening comprehension. And this, again, and sometimes some students think that multiple choice can be very, very easy. But I want you to understand that there are elements in there that can trick you. So you have to be very careful. Which of the following literary devices are not used in the poem? Pun, metaphor, oxymoron. Again, it is hoped that while the passage was being read, you were trying to listen out for elements that would have been indicative of these three devices. The reality is, when you go through it, none of these were used in that poem. None of them. So again, because we're looking at which of the following literary devices are not used in the poem. Which of the following literary devices are not used? And none of them were used. So the trick with it is that because none of these were used, so pun was not used, metaphor was not used, oxymoron was not used, so our answer is D. These were not used. And what they did here, because very often we assume that one of them will be our answer. So we have to be very careful. Now, as we move along, we continue with the rest of our Module 1. Because Module 1 is not just about the listening comprehension. We still have other items. And within those items, what you're going to find we're looking at for items 8 to 15, you're going to be required to understand research methods. This is a key element in the process of gathering and processing information, the main theme for Module 1. So let's take a look at some of the items that we can have here. We're going to look at a few questions that are based on a central prompt. So you can be given a prompt and then asked to answer questions based on that prompt. So for example, a local media group is currently conducting research in order to determine the most and least popular television shows on local broadcasting networks. Pay attention to key elements in your question. So it's a local media group. They're conducting research. They want to be able to determine most and least popular. And they're looking specifically at television shows that are local. Be able to be clear about what it is what the question is asking of you. So the first question from this prompt asks, the most appropriate form of research study in this case would be A, survey, B, document analysis, C, biophysiological methodology, or D, direct observation. Because of the nature of the research that the media group is conducting, and because they want to get the most and least popular, they actually want numbers. They're looking for numbers. And when we're looking at research that involves the collection of information related to how many or how little, how much, quantity, one of the fastest ways to do this is through survey. Because you're able to get the information out there and gather as much of the data as quickly as possible to give you numbers. Then we have the same prompt. The nature of the data to be captured in this situation is primarily what? Again, we identified just now that we're talking about numbers. Qualitative data, we're talking in qualitative, you actually want to know the why of a thing. You want to know why. You're not interested in how much. We're not looking at the quantity. Qualitative looks at the reasons. It's looking at the reasons for your numbers. However, quantitative research is going to look at your numbers. We're going to talk about numbers in quantitative. We're going to talk about figures in quantitative, so that we're able to, even through the process, because again, it's not fixed. We're not looking at fixed data. We're not looking at the non-fixed data. What we're looking at is numbers data. And once you've identified numbers, it is your quantitative data capture. Question 10, still looking at the same prompt. One weakness of using a questionnaire to conduct this particular study is. Now here we have one weakness. You have to make sure that when you're approaching a question like this, you are very clear on what are the pros and cons, the benefits, the advantages and disadvantages of all of the data collection methods. If you don't have that information clearly written out as yet in your notes, make sure you do so before the end of this week. Yes, before the end of the week. Have that written out. Make sure that you can look at it and know what are the advantages and disadvantages of each data collection method. So, A, we're talking here about using the questionnaire. A, it can be disseminated in numerous ways, and we're looking for weaknesses. B, a large cross-section of the sample population can be targeted. C, low rate of return may affect credibility. And D, the halo effect may result. You can have the halo effect resulting. Now, items A and B in particular really speak about advantages. These actually talk about advantages of using the questionnaire. These are advantages. And what we're looking for here would be disadvantages. And this is what, when we talk about the weakness, a weakness here is a disadvantage. So when we talk about the weakness, we're talking specifically about disadvantages. And if you've gone through your notes, one of the disadvantages, one of the primary disadvantages of using a questionnaire to conduct research like this is the concern about low rate of return. Because you may send out a questionnaire and everybody may not fill it out, or if they fill it out, they may not return it. And this is a primary disadvantage of the questionnaire. So the answer here is C. Again, we have here one of those combination types of questions that we spoke about before. The group can administer the questionnaire via 1. Conventional mail, 2. Telephone, or 3. Social media. You need to determine of these 3 options which one or combination, which one or which ones can be used to administer the questionnaire. So can we use conventional mail, put the questionnaire in envelopes, put a stamp on them and send them through TT Post? Can we use the telephone and call people up and ask them the questions and write down and document or record their responses? Can we use social media and send it through Facebook, send it through WhatsApp, use other types of social media to send it out? And the answer is we can use all 3, because all 3 are very good examples of methods that you can use to administer the questionnaire. So our answer here is D. We want to look at one other type of question that you can get in when we get to section B for our module 1. We're still looking at this same prompt. The group decides to use stratified sample to collect data. This is where what needs to happen is you need to know what stratified sample is. More specifically, you need to know and be very clear about what are the different types of sampling that would be employed for data collection. Essentially, what stratified sampling is, and once you know what it is, it really speaks about dividing up your samples, your sample group, your population, dividing it, and then selecting from those individual groups. Once you understand what stratified sample is, you're able to go through your options and find your answer. A says that the sample population is selected at random. B says the population is divided into sections and then a random sample is selected from each section. C says every NTH, every ninth name, and it's usually, this here is specific for when we're talking about quantitative. It is a methodology. This is not an error. And I want you to be clear on what it is. And you can do some more research. And it's a deeper type of analysis. D says the researcher's knowledge of the population and its traits aid in hand-picking the participants. Stratified sample, based on its definition, will be the population is divided into sections and then a random sample is selected from each section. So our answer here is B. We're not doing too badly. So we're going to get ready to take a look at Module 2 types of questions that you can have for your exam. Now the Module 2 items can be found essentially between items 16 to 30, and that can vary. But what you're going to find when you're looking at Module 2 multiple choice questions, you're focusing on looking at the functions of language. You need to understand and remember what are the features of language, and these features are for both Standard English and our English Creole. You want to talk about arguments for and against our Standard English, SE, Standard English, and EC, English Creole. You want to be able to remember clearly those elements surrounding the linguistic history of the Caribbean. What is the history surrounding the languages that we have here and the languages that are used within the region? And you also want to be clear about tone and register. What are the vocabulary that we use to identify writer's tone, speaker's tone? And how do we go through what is being said to determine the register? So we're going to look at a few questions, not all in that section. We're going to look at a few, so you have an idea of what you can expect in our Module 2 for multiple choice. So it can start off again with a prompt. And there's a generalization of using prompts that have characters speaking. So here we have an interaction between a father and a son, David and his father. David says, "Yo, Pops, where's the scene? Looking fresh there. That kid hard." And then his father, who's looking very annoyed, says, "Can't you speak any better? I have no idea what you just said." You're going to have questions based on this prompt. And you immediately understand that there's a difference between what both individuals are saying in terms of the language variety, and you need to be able to identify that immediately before you even get into looking at a single question. So I'm going to ask you, take a picture of this, and we're going to look at the question. So have your smartphones out. And while you're taking the picture, we want to pay close attention. David says, "Yo, Pops, what's the scene? Looking fresh there. That kid hard." And because of what is being said, we see here, Daddy does not understand. So if there's no understanding between the speaker and the listener, we know there's a breakdown in communication. So let's look at what our questions have to put for us, what our questions are asking of us, so we understand what this means. First question says, David uses predominantly A, Caribbean Creole English, B, Standard English, C, slang, or D, profane English. Well, I want you to be very careful. Students can make the error of just simply saying, well, David talking like how we just talk, so it had to be that he's using Creole. But be very careful. We are seeing Creole elements, but there's more to Creole than meets the eye, and especially when we look at this here. Caribbean Creole English, you may be tempted to think that this is the option. So we're going to put a question mark here. But let's explore what the other options are. B says Standard English. We know because they've asked about David. David did not use standard English. In fact, Daddy spoke in standard English. Can't you speak any better? I have no idea what you just said. Daddy used predominantly standard English. So we know that David did not use standard English. C says slang. What is slang? Now, slang refers to phrases, vocabulary, and language that are generational. It changes with each generation. These are words and phrases that when my father was younger and he spoke with his father probably did not understand what he said. By the time I was born, when my father tried to use those same phrases with me, they sounded old-fashioned because they're generational. Slang is associated with a different generation. Another way of looking at it is sometimes when we talk about the young people language, it's going to change with each generation. So it's not isolated to Creole. So if we go back to look at what David says, he say, yo pops, what's the scene? Looking fresh day, that kid hard. What is David actually saying? David is saying, hi dad. Yo pops, hi dad. What's the scene? What's the scene is another way of saying, how are you? But there are different ways over the years that people have said this. Another thing that we look at, he says, looking fresh day. What does that mean? You're looking good. I like how you look. You look outstanding. And further, that kit hard. Now in his father's mind, that kit hard, daddy might be wondering, but I'm not holding a kit in my hand. And why would it be hard? But what David is saying is that what you're wearing looks really good. How you're looking, your appearance from head to toe is phenomenal. So that when we go to our options, what we have with David's language is predominantly slang. There are elements of Creole, but because you're going to find that Creole is almost fixed in its how we use the words, so that you're going to find that a Basilect Creole speaker who is in his 80s can still be understood by a Basilect Creole speaker in their 20s. But where there may be variations is in the slang. That's generational. Profane English is what we talk about when we talk about profanity, when you're cursing, obscene language. And we saw David was not using that with his father. Okay? So our answer here is C. Number 17 says, David's father is most likely unable to understand David due to what? And because we identified that it was slang that David was using, and that slang is generational, it is a language variety that we see within generations. If we look at our options, A says a generation gap, B says different cultures, C, they each speak a different language variety, D, David's father has a negative attitude towards English Creole. From our prompt, it was a matter of David's father not understanding what his son said. So it's not about a negative attitude. We see that they are both using different language varieties, but we can come back and look at it. B says different cultures, but it's David and his father. They're in the same space, in the same home, within the same culture. So we can eliminate B. A says a generation gap. We can be sure that it's about generation because we identify slang as being what David was using, and we said that slang is generational. Because David is using slang, there is a generational gap that can allow a difference in language variety. But his father is most likely here, unable to understand because of a generation gap. Right. So now we have a question that can talk about register. And register talks about the formality, the level of formality that we use when we speak, depending on who we're speaking to. And we have different types of register based on the level of intimacy, the level of familiarity that we have with who we're interacting with. Now, David is speaking to his father. David is speaking to his father so that we know that there's a level of closeness. So we have casual register, formal register, direct register, and an intimate register. Intimate registers are normally used for lovers. We associate an intimate register with people who are in love. You talk about husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends. There is that type of intimacy. A direct register, you're going to just give someone direct information. You can have a direct register when someone is, let's say the police is directing traffic or instructing you, security is instructing you to do something. It's direct, to the point, information given. A formal register, we can see this especially if you're writing a letter to apply for a job, or if you're speaking to someone in authority, you're speaking to your principal, you're speaking to a future employer, and you'd use a formal register. But the casual register, this is what we can use with our family. We use a casual register with family. We use casual register with our friends. And this is the register that David is using here. Number 19 says that the language situation in the Caribbean was affected mostly by. Now, this question tells us that we've now moved away from the original prompt, and now we're looking at another element of our module 2. So we've moved away from the prompt. There may not be anything in the question or on your paper that tells you we've now moved away. But you should be able to identify that based on how the next question is asked. So the language situation in the Caribbean was affected mostly by. I'll always want to direct your attention to these types of words. Best, mostly, more likely. Because what it will always tell you is that there could be more than one answer, but which one is the best answer? Again, it's why we say sometimes the multiple choice can appear to be a bit tricky, but all it takes is some patience while you manage your time and clearly looking at what it is you're being asked to do. So the language situation in the Caribbean was affected mostly by A, the indigenous people. And our indigenous people would be our Caribs and our Arawaks, our Amerindian ancestors and those who were here before, what we call our first people. It can be B, colonization. Colonization involved the process of European powers coming to the Caribbean, bringing their language, along with the enslavements of Africans who also brought their language. That's part of the process of colonization. C, indentured laborers. The indentured laborers, after slavery was abolished, we had an influx of East Indians as well as Chinese, and they also brought their language. And then D says trade. When you trade with people, you're going to have to speak with people, and it would enable you to learn their language as well. Now, all of these are options. All of these are indicative of the Caribbean language situation. But which of these most affected the language of the Caribbean? And if you've chosen B, you are correct. Colonization has had the most impact on the language situation in the Caribbean because colonization brought with it English language. It brought with it the French. We got Spanish. We also got the African languages. And what we've learned is that the combination of these European languages and the African is what would have caused the emergence of our Creole. And we understand that Caribbean Creole is a prominent feature in the language landscape of our region. So while all of the others contributed, the most contribution came from colonization. 20 asks, which of the following highlight the expressive function of language? Again, we are looking at what are some of the questions you can get in your Module 2 component for your exam. So we're talking here about the function of language. What are the functions of language? And we have at least six functions of language that you're going to be encouraged to go back and pay close attention to. This item here is asking about the expressive function. The expressive function of language is that element that is creative in its language, it's emotional in its language, and it helps you to express feelings of love, compassion, and so on. So we have smoking is prohibited in this building. What type of function is this? This one in A, smoking is prohibited. It is informative. It's giving information. B says, I wish to appeal to your sense of goodwill. Where you're talking about appealing to someone's senses, you're using language to persuade. C says, dearly beloved, today we have gathered to witness the matrimony of whoever else. And this here, because when you read this, matrimony talks about wedding, marriage. So we know it's at a wedding, and we're going to talk about what is the purpose of that line. And then D, are you going to lend me a hand with these packages? And it's asking here a question. When we look for the expressive function, we are seeing that in C, because it's emotional. The language and the setting lends itself to emotional expression. It's emotional expression, and again, it is the expressive function of language, and we get it coming out, especially if we talk about things that are poetic in its structure, in its articulation.